we're all a little stunned at this enormous audience. If you've heard about the Piketty book, you know it's a big deal. It's been on a bestseller. It's been quoted all the time, not always positively. I'm going to use the plural we through the whole night, because there was the we is a group of us that sat all summer and read the book together. There was about 12 of us, so we worked our way through the 700 pages. So to get that down to an hour presentation is a little daunting, but we will do the best we can. And I think if you're able to follow along, you will see that this guy presents a framework to see the 21st century, which is really can shift the paradigm of people's thinking. It may or may not. We never know how these books will play out, but it certainly has the potential to do so. I'm going to start here, and this will be entertaining. If nothing else is entertaining, this will be entertaining. Don't do it yet. Don't do it yet. John's got to change the slides, because it's all I can do to think and try and talk. But we're going to start with something that's not from Piketty himself, but was a study done by a Harvard and Duke researcher in 2003. They wanted to try and get a sense of what Americans thought about inequality, and devoid of the usual terms. And they asked a lot of questions, but among them were, they asked the people that, then there were 5,000 respondees, or 5,000 people they found. They said, imagine the United States divided into fifths, to quintiles. The richest fifth, the next fifth, the middle fifth, and so on. And first, give us what you think would be the ideal distribution of wealth in an ideal. Then they asked them to say, well, what do you think that distribution of wealth is in the United States right now? And then thirdly, they revealed what it really was. So go ahead, John. And what they found was on one hand, overwhelmed them with positive feelings. And then there was some negative stuff. This is what they found. This is what the 5,000 Americans responded as an answer to an ideal distribution of wealth, with the richest fifth being down here. And you can see that the richest fifth has got more than a fifth of the wealth. It's something like 32%. But they even, the argument was this bottom fifth, the bottom 20%, should certainly have something close to 10% of the wealth. And what stunned them was that they got these results. There was very little variation depending on whether people were wealthy or poor, women or male, whether they voted Democrat or Republican. They were really rather overwhelmed by this kind of response. They then went on to tell the people they were responding, that did the response, that there is no society in the world that matches that. Nothing that's that close. And so this is an ideal that not even Sweden gets close to. And this is America, individualism and private property, and this is what response they're getting. They were really quite stunned by it. This is what these 5,000 thought was the distribution of wealth in America. And they thought that the top 20% had about 59% of the wealth. It turned out that it's more like 84% of the wealth. They also thought that this bottom 60%, the middle 20 and on down, surely owned at least 21% of America's wealth. In fact, it's closer, it's less than 6. Less than 6 for the bottom 60%, the bottom 60% of America. And so they were really rather thrilled with the results they got. I mean, these guys are a little bit leftist, and they thought, Americans really intuit that the way things are is somewhat unfair. So then they followed their discussion up, or their research up, with seminars in which they asked people to come up with solutions to address this. And the whole thing fell apart on them. Because at that moment, people retreated into their preconceived notions and their preconceived vocabulary. And there was no solutions that anyone could agree on, and people walked out angry. Even though their intuition was that America is not, the wealth distribution is not particularly fair. It is Piketty's goal to get people to discuss this. Above anything else, he would like to have written a book in which he stimulates people like us to have a serious, informed discussion about wealth distribution and its problems. And he also has a warning, and that is, if we don't discuss it, the wealth inequality is clearly growing, and there is a price to pay for it. There's been a price in the past, there will be a price to pay in the future. So before we launch into, or I launch into, a description of 3 core ideas he tries to get across, we've got to do a little vocabulary. And if we don't do the vocabulary up front, then what I'm going to say using his vocabulary won't make a whole lot of sense. So I don't know. Yeah, okay, here we go. So we got 5 terms. You got to oh no, there's Piketty. I messed this up. So I'm already off base. We practiced this and it didn't work. Here's 5 terms that you need to have in your mind in some workable fashion in the next 45 minutes. One is what he is defining as capital and wealth. He uses the terms interchangeably, back and forth. Capital is wealth, wealth is capital. And for him, it's a pretty broad definition. It's pretty much anything that can be exchanged in an open market. So everything, really. Land, buildings, equipment, stocks, bonds, insurance, policies, patents. In another era, would have included slaves. It's anything that can be exchanged in an open market. National income is much more, we know this somewhat more carefully. This is simply GDP. It's the amount of money that changes hands in a society in a year. Typically, and importantly, he makes a big deal about the fact that that income can come basically from 2 places. 1, the wage that we earn, or 2, from what he will call rent, that is profit from capital, like the rent that you can earn from a rental property, or the amount that your stocks go up in a year if you sell those stocks. Typically these days in developed countries, the split in national income for a year is somewhere around 70% of it comes from wage, somewhere around 30% comes from rent on average. Now if you're young, it's pretty much like 100 and 0. All of your income comes from wage and nothing from capital. If you're old, like me, it's more like 0 and 100. Almost none of it comes from wage, and it's all coming from accumulated capital, either mine or the state's or somebody's. 3 more terms. This one is really critical and it's unfamiliar. He takes the 2 terms we just talked about, capital and income, and makes a ratio out of them. And he will use this over and over again, as I will in this presentation. So you got to be familiar with what he's talking about with his capital income ratio. He simply takes the accumulated capital in the society, which has been accumulated forever, and income from a year, which is 1 year's worth of income, and does a division. So for example, if the total value of a capital in a society like ours is 6 times that of income in a year, he then turns that ratio into a percentage ratio. So the capital income ratio in this example would be 600%. This matters enormously. We're going to get there real quickly. You're going to see the importance of this measure. Growth, I think many people have a good sense of what growth is when we talk about it in terms of the nation. It's how much an economy grows in a single year. We're hoping that the American economy will grow 2.4% this year. I'm sure Obama hopes it's more like 5, but it's not going to be. 2.4 is actually probably what it's going to be this year. In Europe, it's going to be much less, more like 0.05. We've been hearing about growth in China, 7% a year, 10% a year. So that varies. But that's a fairly familiar term, I think. This one is less familiar. The return on capital, rate of return on capital, R, it's equivalent to growth, but this is the amount of yield that capital will produce in a year. In other words, the amount of profit. So if you have a $1 million rental property and you get $50,000 rent in that for a year, the calculation is 50,000 divided by 1 million, and that will produce an R of 5%. So next, John. Here, this maybe helps to anchor you a little bit in this discussion, because now we have some real numbers that are typical of Western societies these days. Sort of ballpark capital income ratios in Western societies these days are 600%. Still doesn't mean anything to you, but just sort of anchor yourself with that number. The return on capital is in the neighborhood of 5 all across Western societies. Growth, on the other hand, varies like crazy, from fast-growing economies like China to relatively slow to really slow economies like Europe these days. That varies. Now we're going to jump to using those terms in a way that sort of starts to build the story that Piketty's trying to get across. Now you'll start to see a little bit about why his term capital income ratio is such an important calculation that he uses. And he makes the point and justifies it over and over again. He's got this mountain of research. Historically, if the capital income ratio is high, then it automatically means the wealth inequality in that society is high. And that is a piece of information you can sort of bank and say, if we get, and what's high? Well, 700 is really high. So if the capital income ratio in a country like Europe in 1910, just before World War I, is 700%, you say that's high. Well, how high? Well, this high. Europe, just as World War I is about to open, the top 10% owns 90% of Europe's wealth. The middle 40%, you know, what made the middle is hard to tell, but the middle 40%, 5, the bottom 50%, 5. I mean, almost all the wealth's owned by the top 10%. Did this help cause World War I? Sure did. But we're not going to do a history lesson on that. You jump again 60 years to great old socialist Scandinavia, you know, this almost red country, just barely right of the Soviet Union, so people thought. Well, you have a much lower capital income ratio and would expect there a much less inequality. It's true, but even so, it's kind of stunning. The top 10% in Scandinavia in 1970 still owned 50% of the wealth. Middle 40 had their 40, that's good. The bottom 50 only 10. Of course, what did that bottom 50 have, even though they didn't own wealth? They had health care, they had education, they had other social services. They didn't own the wealth from which they produced that, but they did have that. Jump ahead to us just about now with a capital income ratio of 500. It's not Europe yet in pre-World War I, but it's sneaking up. I mean, this is growing by the year. What's that translate into, that 500? Well, you can see it. Top 10%, 70% of the wealth, middle 40, 25, and dropping the bottom 50, almost nothing. So if you have that, if you can lock that into place, a high capital income ratio is going to indicate relatively high inequality. The vocabulary that follows later will make some sense.